My name is Lodi, and until 3 days ago I believed my life would follow the quiet path of a temple scribe, mapping the sacred lands of Egypt in careful detail while the great events of the kingdom unfolded around me without my participation. I lived in the shadow of Thoth's temple in a small city along the Nile, earning my bread by creating maps for merchants and pilgrims, my body marked with the intricate tattoos that recorded the most sacred geographical knowledge of our people. These markings, etched into my skin with inks mixed from crushed lapis lazuli and gold, were not mere decoration but a living library of Egypt's hidden places, secret routes, and forgotten pathways that existed nowhere else in written form. The people of my city considered me strange, an oddity to be tolerated rather than embraced. I had no family, having been orphaned as a child and raised by the priests of Thoth who saw potential in my keen eye for detail and my ability to visualize the relationships between distant places. My fellow citizens found my solitary nature unsettling. The way I would disappear for days at a time to survey remote regions, returning with new knowledge to add to the maps that covered my body like a second skin. But I was content with this isolation, finding companionship in the silent communion with the land itself, in the satisfaction of accurately recording the curve of a river or the location of a hidden oasis. The tattoos that marked me as different were also my greatest treasure, a repository of knowledge that made me valuable to travelers and scholars even as it marked me as an outsider in normal society. My peaceful existence came to an abrupt end when news reached our city of rebellion in Upper Egypt. A coalition of provincial governors had declared their independence from Pharaoh's rule, claiming that the young king lacked the divine mandate to govern the land of the Nile. The uprising had spread quickly, with several major cities falling to the rebels and their armies now marching toward Memphis itself. The crisis demanded divine intervention, according to the priests who served our temple. The gods were angry, they declared, and required appeasement through blood sacrifice to restore the natural order. A human offering was needed, someone whose death would demonstrate the community's devotion and hopefully turn the tide of war in Pharaoh's favor. The choice fell upon me, though I learned of it only when the temple guards came to collect me from my small dwelling beside the cartographer's workshop. "You have been chosen for a great honor," the high priest announced as armed men surrounded my home, preventing any possibility of escape. "The gods have called you to serve them in the afterlife, to carry our prayers directly to the divine realm." I understood immediately what this meant. My lack of family ties, my status as an outsider, my strange appearance marked by the tattoos that covered my arms and chest, all of these factors had made me the perfect candidate for sacrifice. No one would mourn my passing. No one would question the wisdom of offering my life to appease divine wrath. The journey to Memphis took 3 days, during which I was treated with the mixture of reverence and pity typically accorded to sacrificial victims. I was given the finest food and drink, clothed in expensive linen, adorned with gold jewelry that marked my status as an offering to the gods. But I was also watched constantly, my movements restricted to prevent any attempt at escape. As our boat approached the great capital, I found myself studying the city's layout with professional interest despite my dire circumstances. The massive pyramids that dominated the western horizon, the sprawling temple complexes that lined the river, the organized grid of streets and canals that spoke of careful urban planning. All of these details were automatically cataloged in my mind even as I faced the prospect of imminent death. The palace of Pharaoh Smetra was more magnificent than anything I had ever imagined, a complex of buildings and courtyards that seemed to stretch endlessly along the riverbank. The walls were covered with painted reliefs depicting the glorious deeds of past rulers, while columns carved from single blocks of granite supported roofs that soared toward the heavens like man-made mountains. I was brought before the throne in the hour before dawn, when the first rays of the sun would provide the perfect moment for my sacrifice to Osiris, Lord of the underworld. The great hall was filled with nobles and priests, all gathered to witness the sacred ritual that would hopefully restore divine favor to Egypt's struggling armies. But it was the figure seated upon the golden throne who captured my attention completely. Pharaoh Amenhotep was younger than I had expected, perhaps no more than 25 years of age, with the lean build of a warrior and eyes that held depths of intelligence and compassion that seemed at odds with his reputation for harsh rule. When his gaze fell upon me, I felt something stir within my chest that had nothing to do with fear of approaching death. The high priest began the ritual invocation, calling upon Osiris to accept this offering and grant victory to Egypt's forces. But as he spoke, I noticed that the young pharaoh's attention was not focused on the ceremony, but on the tattoos that covered my exposed arms and chest. His dark eyes traced the intricate patterns with growing fascination, as if he were reading a message written in a language only he could understand. When the priest raised the ceremonial dagger that would end my life, Pharaoh Amenhotep suddenly raised his hand to halt the proceedings. "Wait," he commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of divine kingship. "Bring the prisoner closer. I would examine these markings more carefully." I was pushed forward until I stood directly before the throne, close enough to see the intelligence that burned in the young ruler's eyes, close enough to catch the subtle scent of frankincense and myrrh that clung to his royal garments. When he gestured for me to remove my outer robe, revealing the full extent of the tattoos that covered my torso, I heard gasps of amazement from the assembled courtiers. "These are not mere decorations," Amenhotep said, his voice filled with wonder as he studied the intricate geographical details that had been etched into my skin. "These are maps, detailed records of places that exist nowhere else in our kingdom's archives. Look here," he continued, pointing to a section near my heart where the secret pathways through the western desert were recorded. "This shows routes that our own scouts have never discovered, oases that could save an army from dying of thirst." The high priest protested that the sacrifice must proceed, that the gods demanded blood before the sun reached its zenith. But Pharaoh Amenhotep was no longer listening to the religious authorities. His attention was entirely focused on me, on the living library of geographical knowledge that covered my body like a second skin. "You will not die today," he declared, his words carrying the weight of divine decree. "The gods have sent you to us not as a sacrifice but as a gift, a living oracle whose knowledge will guide Egypt to victory. You will serve at my side as sacred interpreter of the divine will, reading the messages that the gods have written upon your very flesh." The transformation of my status from sacrificial victim to royal advisor happened so quickly that I barely had time to process what was occurring. One moment I had been facing certain death, the next I was being escorted to chambers within the palace itself, dressed in fine linens and assigned servants to attend to my needs. But the true change in my circumstances became apparent only during my first private audience with the pharaoh, when we were alone in his personal study surrounded by scrolls and tablets containing the administrative records of the kingdom. Away from the formal atmosphere of the throne room, Amenhotep revealed himself to be not the harsh autocrat his public persona suggested, but a thoughtful young man struggling with the immense burdens of kingship. "Tell me about yourself," he said, settling into a chair across from where I sat with my maps spread before us. "Not the official story about divine messages and sacred markings, but the truth about who you are and how you came to possess such extraordinary knowledge." I found myself speaking more freely than I ever had before, describing my childhood among the priests of Thoth, my training in the arts of cartography and surveying, the years I had spent traveling throughout Egypt to create the most accurate maps possible. I explained how the tattoos had begun as simple reference marks to help me remember important locations, but had gradually evolved into a comprehensive geographical record that covered my entire body. As I spoke, I became aware of the way Amenhotep was listening, his dark eyes never leaving my face, his attention focused entirely on my words, rather than the formal protocols that usually governed interactions between ruler and subject. There was something intimate about this conversation, a quality of genuine human connection that I had never experienced before. When I finished my account, he was quiet for a long moment, studying my face as if trying to read secrets written there. Then he began to tell me about his own life, about the loneliness of absolute power, about the weight of responsibility that had fallen upon his shoulders when his father died unexpectedly, leaving him to rule a kingdom in crisis. "I never wanted to be Pharaoh," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to be a scholar, to study the ancient texts and perhaps travel to distant lands to learn about other peoples and their ways. But fate decreed otherwise, and now I must pretend to be something I never was, must make decisions that affect millions of lives while feeling like a child playing at being a man." The vulnerability in his confession touched something deep within my chest, a recognition of kindred loneliness that transcended the vast differences in our social positions. Here was someone else who felt isolated by circumstances beyond his control, someone who understood what it meant to be defined by others' expectations rather than personal choice. Our conversation continued late into the night, ranging from practical matters of kingdom administration to philosophical questions about the nature of divine authority and mortal responsibility. I found myself offering insights drawn from my travels, describing how different regions of Egypt had their own unique challenges and resources, how the kingdom's strength lay not in uniformity, but in the diversity of its people and landscapes. When we finally parted, just before dawn broke over the palace walls, I felt as though something fundamental had changed between us. The formal relationship between Pharaoh and advisor had evolved into something more personal, more intimate, though neither of us had spoken directly of the attraction that was growing between us. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into my new role with enthusiasm, using my geographical knowledge to help Amenhotep make strategic decisions about troop movements and supply lines. The tattoos on my body proved invaluable in planning military campaigns, as they revealed routes and resources that official maps had missed or forgotten. But it was the private moments we shared that truly mattered to me. Each evening, after the formal business of the court had concluded, Amenhotep would summon me to his private chambers where we would discuss the day's events and plan for the challenges ahead. These conversations gradually became more personal, as we shared stories of our pasts and dreams for the future. I began to notice small signs of the growing connection between us. The way his hand would linger when he pointed to locations on my tattooed skin, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at me across the council chamber, the way he would find excuses to keep me near him during public ceremonies. My own feelings were becoming equally difficult to hide, as I found myself thinking about him constantly, analyzing every word and gesture for signs of reciprocated affection. The first time he touched me with clear romantic intent, we were alone in the palace gardens during one of our evening walks. The moon was full, casting silver light across the lotus ponds and date palms that surrounded us with privacy. We had been discussing the progress of the military campaign against the rebels, but the conversation had gradually shifted to more personal topics. "You have changed everything for me," he said suddenly, stopping beside a fountain where sacred ibis birds stood motionless in the shallow water. "Before you came, I felt like I was drowning in the responsibilities of kingship, suffocating under the weight of expectations I could never meet. But now, with your guidance and your presence, I feel like I can actually be the ruler Egypt needs." The sincerity in his voice made my heart race, and when he reached out to trace one of the tattoos on my forearm with his fingertip, I felt electricity course through my entire body. The touch was gentle but deliberate, a clear signal of his romantic interest that could not be misinterpreted. "I have never felt this way about anyone before," I admitted, my voice barely audible above the sound of water flowing through the fountain. "Growing up isolated as I did, I never learned how to form close connections with other people. But with you, everything feels natural, inevitable, as if the gods themselves planned for us to find each other." He stepped closer then, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. When he cupped my face in his hands and leaned down to kiss me, I felt the last barriers between us dissolve completely. The kiss was gentle at first, exploratory, as if we were both afraid that too much passion might shatter the fragile connection we had built. But as I responded to his touch, pressing closer to him in the moonlight, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of months of suppressed longing finally finding expression. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard, our hearts racing with the intensity of emotions that could no longer be denied. Without words, he took my hand and led me back through the palace corridors to his private chambers, where we spent the night discovering each other's bodies with the same careful attention I had once devoted to mapping the landscape of Egypt. The physical intimacy was wonderful, but what moved me even more was the emotional vulnerability he showed in those quiet hours before dawn. Stripped of his royal regalia and the formal protocols of kingship, Amenhotep revealed himself to be not a divine ruler but a young man hungry for genuine connection, desperate for someone who could see past the crown to the person beneath. Our relationship deepened over the following months, though we were careful to maintain discretion in public settings. Egypt's political situation remained volatile, with the rebellion in Upper Egypt continuing to threaten the stability of the kingdom. Any scandal involving the pharaoh's personal life could provide ammunition for his enemies and potentially destabilize the fragile peace we were working to maintain. But our private moments together became the foundation of everything else in my life. Each night, when the formal business of the court concluded, we would retreat to his chambers where I would help him plan military strategies while he shared his deeper thoughts about the nature of leadership and the burden of divine authority. It was during one of these intimate conversations that he first spoke directly of his love for me. We were lying together in his bed, my head resting on his chest while he traced the tattoos that covered my shoulders and back. The rebellion in the south was finally showing signs of weakening, and there was hope that peace might soon be restored to the kingdom. "I love you," he said simply, his fingers pausing in their exploration of my marked skin. "Not as Pharaoh loves a useful advisor, not as a ruler values a loyal servant, but as a man loves another man. You have become essential to my happiness in ways that have nothing to do with your geographical knowledge or your strategic insights." The words sent warmth flooding through my entire body, validation of feelings I had been nurturing for months but had never dared to express directly. "I love you too," I replied, lifting my head to look into his eyes. "More than I ever thought possible, more than I knew I was capable of feeling. You have given me not just a place in your kingdom but a place in your heart, and that is a treasure beyond any map or scroll." We sealed this mutual declaration with kisses that grew increasingly passionate, as if our spoken love had freed us to express the depth of our physical desire for each other. That night marked a new phase in our relationship, one in which we no longer had to hide our feelings even from ourselves. But our happiness was threatened by growing political tensions within the palace itself. The priests and nobles who surrounded Amenhotep had never fully accepted my rapid rise from sacrificial victim to royal advisor. My lack of noble bloodlines, my strange appearance marked by tattoos, my intimate relationship with the pharaoh, all of these factors made me a target for those who resented my influence over the kingdom's policies. The opposition was led by Hamu, the high priest of Ptah, whose authority had been diminished by my presence at court. He was a clever man, politically sophisticated, who understood that attacking me directly would be seen as challenging the pharaoh's judgment. Instead, he began to question the divine nature of my supposed prophetic abilities, suggesting that my influence over royal decisions was based on trickery rather than genuine mystical insight. The crisis came to a head when Hamu demanded public proof of my divine connection. "If you are truly a sacred interpreter as the pharaoh claims," he declared during a formal court session, "then demonstrate your power by predicting the outcome of our campaign against the Libyan raiders who threaten our western borders." The challenge was cleverly constructed, as it put both Amenhotep and me in an impossible position. If I refused to make the prediction, it would suggest that my abilities were fraudulent. But if I agreed and my prediction proved wrong, it would discredit not just me but the pharaoh who had elevated me to such an important position. I had no choice but to accept the challenge, though I knew I was walking into a trap. My geographical knowledge was extensive, but I had no genuine ability to see the future or receive messages from the gods. Everything I had accomplished as a royal advisor had been based on careful analysis of practical factors, not mystical revelation. Using my knowledge of the desert routes and my understanding of military tactics, I made my best guess about how the campaign would unfold. The Libyans, I predicted, would be defeated within 2 weeks, driven back across the border through a combination of direct assault and strategic cutting of their supply lines. For the first week, events seemed to confirm my prediction. Egyptian forces engaged the raiders successfully, winning several preliminary skirmishes and advancing steadily into enemy territory. But then disaster struck in the form of an unexpected sandstorm that lasted for 3 days, blinding our troops and allowing the Libyans to launch a surprise counterattack that inflicted heavy casualties and forced a temporary retreat. The military setback was not catastrophic in itself. Egyptian forces regrouped quickly and ultimately achieved victory. But the fact that my prediction had proven inaccurate gave Hamu the ammunition he needed to attack my credibility. "The supposed oracle has been revealed as a fraud," he declared publicly. His failure to foresee this setback proves that he possesses no divine gifts, that he has been deceiving our beloved Pharaoh with cleverly constructed lies. The political pressure on Amenhotep became enormous, as nobles and priests who had never accepted my presence at court now had apparent proof that I was indeed a charlatan who had somehow tricked their ruler into believing in non-existent mystical abilities. For the first time since my arrival at the palace, I began to fear not just for my position but for my life. The breaking point came during a formal court session where Hamu presented a detailed case against my continued presence at court. He argued that my influence over royal decisions had been based on deception, that my relationship with the pharaoh was inappropriate and potentially damaging to the kingdom's stability. The assembled nobles murmured their agreement, and I could see that even some of Amenhotep's closest advisors were beginning to question his judgment in elevating me to such an important position. Unable to bear the shame of having my beloved subjected to such criticism because of my failures, I made the decision to leave the palace before I could be formally banished. That night, I gathered my few possessions and slipped away from the royal complex, heading west into the desert where I could disappear among the trackless sands and spare Amenhotep the political damage of continuing to defend me. The next few days were among the darkest of my life, as I wandered through the wasteland wondering what would become of me now that I had lost not just my position but the love that had made my existence meaningful. I had water and food enough for perhaps a week, but no clear destination or plan for survival beyond that. It was on the third day of my exile that I saw the dust cloud on the horizon that indicated approaching riders. My first thought was that Hamu had sent soldiers to ensure my permanent silence, and I prepared to sell my life dearly if necessary. But as the figures drew closer, I recognized the distinctive armor and banners that marked them as members of the royal guard. At their head rode Amenhotep himself, his face set in lines of determination that spoke of desperate urgency. When he saw me standing alone among the sand dunes, he spurred his horse forward and leaped down before the animal had come to a complete stop. "How could you leave me like that?" he demanded, his voice raw with emotion as he gripped my shoulders. "How could you think that I would allow political pressure to drive away the most important person in my life?" I tried to explain my reasoning, how I had hoped to spare him the continuing controversy of defending someone who had apparently been exposed as a fraud. But he cut off my words with a kiss that spoke of relief and desperate need, holding me against him as if he feared I might disappear again if he loosened his grip. When we finally broke apart, he began to tell me the truth about my time at court, revelations that changed everything I thought I understood about our relationship. "I never believed in the mystical nature of your tattoos," he admitted, his hands still gripping my arms as if to anchor me in place. "From the first moment I saw you, I knew that your knowledge was based on careful observation and study, not divine revelation." "Then why did you save me from sacrifice?" I asked, confused by this admission. "Why did you create the fiction about sacred messages and prophetic abilities?" "Because I saw something in you that I had never encountered before," he replied, his dark eyes intense with sincerity. "Intelligence, dedication, a quality of mind that I knew could be invaluable in governing the kingdom. And because, even in that first moment, I felt drawn to you in ways I did not fully understand. The story about divine messages was simply a way to justify keeping you close, to protect you from those who would have seen your elevation as inappropriate." The revelation that he had never believed in my supposed mystical abilities should have been devastating, but instead I felt a profound sense of relief. He had not fallen in love with an oracle or a divine messenger, but with me, the simple cartographer whose only special gift was an eye for geographical detail and a willingness to work hard in service of something larger than himself. "You mean you loved me for who I actually am, not for what people thought I represented?" I asked, hardly daring to believe that such acceptance was possible. "I have loved you from the beginning," he said firmly. "Your intelligence, your dedication, your quiet strength, the way you listen to problems and find practical solutions rather than hiding behind mystical nonsense. The tattoos that mark your body are beautiful because they represent knowledge and craftsmanship, not because I believe they carry messages from the gods." Standing there in the desert with the man I loved, finally understanding the true foundation of our relationship, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I had not even realized I was carrying. The fear of being exposed as a fraud, the constant pressure to maintain a pretense of mystical abilities, all of that was gone now that the truth was finally spoken between us. But our personal reconciliation did not solve the political crisis that had driven me into exile. Hamu and his allies were still waiting at court, still demanding proof that I possessed the divine gifts that justified my position as royal advisor. Simply returning to the palace would not be enough. We needed some way to demonstrate my value that did not depend on fraudulent claims of mystical ability. It was then that I proposed the plan that would ultimately save both my position and the kingdom itself. The Libyan raiders had been defeated, but intelligence reports suggested that they were regrouping for another assault, this time with reinforcements from tribes deeper in the western desert. Traditional Egyptian military tactics, which relied on controlling the Nile Valley and its approaches, would be insufficient against enemies who could strike from the trackless wastes and disappear again before retaliations could be organized. But I knew something that no one else in Egypt knew, something that was recorded in the tattoos that covered my body but existed nowhere in the official archives. During my years of traveling and surveying, I had discovered an ancient system of underground canals and passages that connected the pyramid complexes to hidden chambers far beneath the desert floor. These tunnels had been built by the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom, engineering marvels that allowed massive amounts of stone and supplies to be moved without detection by potential enemies or thieves. Most of the passages had been sealed and forgotten over the centuries, but I had mapped their locations during my explorations and recorded the routes in the tattoos that marked my skin. If I could guide Egyptian forces through these hidden passages, I explained to Amenhotep as we made our way back toward the capital, we could emerge behind the Libyan positions and trap them between our forces and the desert. It would be a complete strategic surprise, the kind of victory that would not only eliminate the immediate threat but establish Egyptian dominance over the western approaches for generations to come. The plan required precise timing and perfect knowledge of the underground routes, capabilities that only I possessed among all the advisors and generals in Egypt. More importantly, it would demonstrate that my value to the kingdom was based on real, practical knowledge rather than mystical pretensions. When we returned to the palace, Amenhotep immediately convened his military council to discuss the new Libyan threat. But instead of presenting my plan directly, he allowed me to explain it myself, giving me the opportunity to demonstrate my strategic thinking and geographical expertise to the assembled generals and advisors. The underground passages I described seemed impossible to most of the council members, who had never heard of such extensive tunnel systems beneath the desert. But when I showed them the detailed maps tattooed on my body, tracing routes that connected pyramid complexes separated by dozens of miles, they began to understand the scope of what I was proposing. General Amenemheb, the kingdom's most experienced military commander, studied the tattoos with growing amazement. If these routes truly exist, he said slowly, they would give us capabilities that no army in the world could match. We could move forces across vast distances without detection, supply them through channels that enemies could never find or cut, strike where we are least expected and disappear before retaliation is possible. The tattoos that had once been dismissed as mere decoration were now revealed as the most valuable military intelligence in Egypt's possession. Knowledge that existed nowhere else in the kingdom, information that could reshape the entire strategic balance between Egypt and its neighbors. When Hamu attempted to continue his criticism of my presence at court, pointing out that my earlier prediction about the Libyan campaign had proven inaccurate, Amenhotep cut him off with royal authority that brooked no disagreement. The value of Lodi's counsel has been proven beyond question, he declared. His knowledge of Egypt's hidden geography is a treasure beyond price, and any who question his position at court are questioning the wisdom of Pharaoh himself. The high priest had no choice but to accept this royal decree, though I could see in his eyes that his hostility toward me had not diminished. But with the support of the military council and the promise of strategic advantages that my knowledge could provide, my position at court was now secure regardless of priestly opposition. Over the following week, I worked closely with the kingdom's best engineers and military advisors to plan the underground assault on the Libyan positions. The technical challenges were enormous, as the ancient tunnels had been sealed for centuries and would require careful excavation to make them passable for military forces. But as we delved deeper into the planning, I began to appreciate the true scope of what the pyramid builders had accomplished. The underground system was not just a collection of random passages, but a carefully designed network that connected every major pyramid complex in Egypt. With proper restoration, It could serve as a hidden highway system that would give Egyptian forces unparalleled strategic mobility. The excavation work required absolute secrecy, as any hint of our preparations would allow the Libyans to adjust their positions and counter our strategy. Teams of workers labored night and day to clear debris from the ancient passages, guided by the detailed maps tattooed on my body and supervised by engineers who gradually came to appreciate the sophistication of the Old Kingdom's construction techniques. I spent most of my time underground during this period, leading survey teams through passages that had not seen human presence for over 1,000 years. The experience was both exhilarating and humbling, as I walked through tunnels that represented one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. But it was also during this time that my relationship with Amenhotep deepened in new ways. The pressure of preparing for battle, combined with the technical challenges of the excavation project, created a crucible in which our partnership was tested and strengthened. He trusted me completely with the kingdom's most ambitious military operation, while I drew strength from his unwavering support even when technical difficulties threatened to derail our plans. Our private moments together became even more precious during this period of intense preparation. Each night, when we finally retreated to his chambers after long days spent planning and supervising, we would hold each other with desperate intensity, both of us aware that the coming battle could separate us forever. The assault itself was launched on a moonless night, when darkness would provide maximum cover for our forces moving through the underground passages. I led the advance teams personally, guiding them through routes that I had memorized from years of careful exploration and mapping. The experience of moving through those ancient tunnels with hundreds of soldiers was unlike anything I had ever imagined. The passages were larger than they appeared on my maps, wide enough for multiple columns of men to advance simultaneously, with ingenious ventilation systems that kept the air fresh even deep underground. When we finally emerged from hidden entrances behind the Libyan positions, the surprise was absolute. The raiders had positioned themselves to repel attacks from the east, where they expected Egyptian forces to approach. They had no defenses prepared against assault from the west, from directions they thought were protected by trackless desert. The battle was brief and decisive. Caught between Amenhotep's main force advancing from the river valley and my underground contingent attacking from the rear, the Libyans had no opportunity to organize effective resistance. Within hours, their entire army was either dead, captured, or fleeing back toward their homeland. But the true significance of the victory lay not in its immediate tactical results but in what it demonstrated about Egyptian capabilities. The kingdom now possessed a strategic advantage that no enemy could counter, a hidden highway system that allowed rapid movement of forces across vast distances without detection. When news of the victory reached the capital, my position at court was transformed completely. No longer was I seen as a controversial figure whose influence depended on questionable mystical claims. Instead, I had become the architect of a military triumph that secured Egypt's borders and demonstrated the kingdom's superiority over all potential enemies. The celebration that followed our return to Memphis was unlike anything the capital had seen in years. Streets were filled with cheering crowds, temples rang with thanksgiving hymns, and the palace hosted festivities that lasted for days. But for me, the most meaningful moment came during the formal ceremony where Amenhotep publicly acknowledged my contributions to the kingdom's success. Standing before the assembled court, wearing the finest robes that royal artisans could create, I heard the Pharaoh proclaim that I would henceforth hold the title of Chief Strategic Advisor, with authority second only to his own in matters of military planning and territorial defense. But even more significant was the personal declaration that followed. Lodi has proven himself not just a valuable counselor but a trusted partner in all aspects of governing this kingdom, Amenhotep announced, his voice carrying clearly across the vast throne room. His wisdom guides our decisions, his knowledge protects our borders, and his presence enriches the royal court. Let it be known throughout Egypt that he stands at Pharaoh's side not as servant but as chosen companion, honored and respected for his contributions to our realm's prosperity. The declaration was as close to a public acknowledgement of our romantic relationship as the political realities of the time would allow, but everyone present understood its significance. I was no longer just an advisor but the Pharaoh's consort, with all the protection and status that such a position implied. That night, as we celebrated privately in his chambers, Amenhotep spoke of plans that went beyond military victory or political stability. "I want to explore the full extent of those underground passages," he said, his eyes bright with excitement as he traced the tattoos that mapped the ancient tunnel system. Not for military purposes but for knowledge itself, to understand what our ancestors accomplished and perhaps to discover new connections that could benefit the kingdom. The idea of a joint expedition to map and explore the underground network appealed to me enormously. It would combine my passion for geographical discovery with our shared partnership, allowing us to work together on a project that could have lasting benefits for Egypt while strengthening the bonds between us. Over the following months, we began to plan what would become the most ambitious archaeological expedition in Egyptian history. Teams of engineers, surveyors, and scholars would systematically explore and document the entire underground network, creating accurate maps that would be preserved for future generations while identifying passages that could be restored for practical use. But the expedition would also serve a deeper purpose, providing an opportunity for Amenhotep and me to travel together throughout Egypt, visiting regions that he had never seen despite ruling over them. As Pharaoh, his movements were usually restricted to formal state visits with elaborate protocol and security arrangements. This journey would allow him to see his kingdom as I had seen it during my years of solitary exploration, to understand the land and its people through direct personal experience. The preparation took almost a year, as we assembled the necessary equipment and personnel while ensuring that the kingdom's administration could function effectively during our absence. But finally, on a morning when the Nile was at its lowest ebb and the weather was perfect for desert travel, our expedition departed from Memphis. Our first destination was the Great Pyramid Complex at Giza, where the most extensive underground passages had been discovered during our military preparations. Standing together at the entrance to tunnels that had been sealed for over a millennium, I felt a profound sense of completion, as if everything in my life had been leading to this moment. "You have given me everything I never knew I wanted," Amenhotep said quietly as we prepared to descend into the ancient passages. "Knowledge, love, purpose, the chance to be not just a ruler but an explorer and discoverer. Whatever we find down there, the greatest treasure will be the experience of finding it together." The underground network proved to be even more extensive and sophisticated than my original surveys had suggested. Passages connected not just the major pyramid complexes but dozens of smaller sites, creating a transportation system that spanned the entire length of Egypt. The engineering was remarkable, with precise gradients that allowed water to flow through channels that irrigated underground chambers, ventilation shafts that brought fresh air to the deepest levels, and storage areas that could have supplied entire cities during times of siege. But what moved me most was not the technical achievements of the ancient builders but the experience of sharing these discoveries with the man I loved. Each new chamber we explored, each passage we mapped, each insight we gained into the capabilities of our ancestors, all of these became part of the growing tapestry of our relationship. We would spend our days underground, carefully documenting what we found, then emerge into the desert evening to camp under stars that seemed closer and brighter than they ever had in the city. Around our campfire, we would discuss what we had learned, plan the next day's exploration, and talk about the implications of our discoveries for Egypt's future. These conversations revealed new depths to Amenhotep's character that I had never seen during our time at court. Away from the formal protocols and political pressures of the palace, he was free to express his natural curiosity and enthusiasm for learning. I discovered that beneath the stern facade of divine kingship was a man who genuinely loved knowledge for its own sake, who found joy in understanding how things worked and wonder in contemplating the achievements of past generations. Our physical relationship also deepened during these months of shared exploration. Sleeping together under the desert stars, bathing together in hidden oases, making love in chambers that had been sealed since the time of the pyramid builders. All of these experiences created an intimacy that went beyond anything we had shared in the palace. The expedition lasted almost 6 months, during which we systematically explored and mapped the entire underground network. When we finally returned to Memphis, we brought with us not just detailed records of our discoveries but a transformed understanding of Egypt's capabilities and potential. The knowledge we had gained would have profound implications for the kingdom's future. The underground passages could serve as a hidden highway system during times of war, as secure storage for essential supplies during times of crisis, as a means of irrigation during times of drought. We had discovered not just archaeological treasures but practical resources that could benefit Egypt for centuries to come. But for me, the most valuable result of our expedition was the deepening of our relationship. We had worked together as true partners, sharing dangers and discoveries, supporting each other through challenges and celebrating each triumph together. When we stood once again before the throne of Egypt, we were no longer just Pharaoh and advisor but a team whose combined capabilities exceeded the sum of their individual parts. The formal ceremonies that marked our return included a public acknowledgement of our partnership that went beyond anything that had been proclaimed before. Standing before the assembled court, Amenhotep declared that our joint expedition had proven the value of collaboration between minds that complemented each other, between different types of knowledge and skill working in harmony. Lodi brings to our partnership not just geographical knowledge but wisdom, dedication, and a quality of character that makes him worthy of the highest trust and deepest affection, he announced. Together, we have accomplished more than either could have achieved alone, and together we will continue to work for Egypt's prosperity and greatness. The declaration was met with applause from the assembled nobles and priests, including even Hamu, who had finally accepted that my position at court was both legitimate and permanent. The man who had once faced execution as a sacrificial victim was now recognized as one of the most valuable advisors in the kingdom's history. But the most meaningful moment came that evening, when we were finally alone together in the privacy of his chambers. The formal celebrations were over, the political statements had been made, and we could simply be ourselves without the need for public performance or official protocol. "I have something to ask you," Amenhotep said, his voice carrying a note of nervousness that I had not heard since our first private conversation years earlier. "Something that I have been thinking about throughout our expedition but have not had the courage to speak aloud." I waited, sensing that whatever he was about to say would be significant for both of us. "I want you to be not just my advisor or my consort but my equal partner in ruling Egypt," he continued, his dark eyes intense with sincerity. "I want to create a new model of leadership, one based on collaboration rather than individual authority. One that recognizes that the best decisions come from combining different perspectives and areas of expertise." The proposal was unprecedented in Egyptian history, where Pharaoh's authority had always been absolute and individual. But it was also a logical extension of what we had already accomplished together, a formal recognition of the partnership that had already proven its effectiveness. "Would you be willing to share not just my bed and my counsels but my throne?" he asked. "To be acknowledged not just as my beloved but as my co-ruler, with all the responsibilities and privileges that such a position would entail." The question took my breath away, not just because of its political implications but because of what it revealed about his feelings for me. He was offering to share the most precious thing he possessed, the divine authority that defined his very identity, with someone who had begun as a sacrificial victim and had risen through merit and love to stand at his side. "Yes," I said simply, my voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will share your throne as I have shared your heart, your burdens as I have shared your joys. Together, we will be stronger than either could be alone." The kiss that sealed this agreement was different from any we had shared before, deeper and more meaningful because it marked not just romantic love, but a commitment to face the future as true partners in every sense of the word. The formal coronation ceremony that made me co-pharaoh took place 3 months later, after legal scholars had worked out the unprecedented protocols required for such an arrangement. Standing before the altar of Ptah, wearing the ceremonial regalia that marked me as equal to the man I loved, I felt the weight of history settling upon my shoulders. But I also felt the strength that came from knowing I would not bear this burden alone. Whatever challenges Egypt might face in the years to come, we would meet them together, combining our different strengths and perspectives to find solutions that neither could have developed independently. The ceremony concluded with a proclamation that established our joint rule not as a temporary expedient but as a new model for Egyptian kingship, one based on partnership and collaboration rather than individual authority. The message was clear. Egypt would be stronger because it was led by two minds working in harmony rather than one consciousness struggling alone. That night, as we lay together in the bed we now shared as co-rulers of the greatest kingdom on earth, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought us to this point. From sacrificial victim to royal advisor to co-pharaoh, from solitary cartographer to beloved partner of the most powerful man in Egypt. The changes seemed almost impossible to believe, but they had happened through the combination of knowledge, courage, and above all love, the force that had transformed both of our lives and created something greater than either of us could have achieved alone. The tattoos that covered my body, once seen as marks of strangeness, were now recognized as symbols of the unique knowledge and perspective I brought to our partnership. You have taught me that love is not about finding someone who complements your weaknesses, but about finding someone who challenges you to become stronger. Amenhotep said as we held each other in the darkness. You have made me a better ruler and a better man, and I promise to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of the trust you have placed in me. I love you not just for who you are but for who we become together, I replied, my fingers tracing the familiar lines of his face in the darkness. Separately, we might have been good at what we do, but together we are capable of greatness that will outlast our individual lives. The years that followed proved the wisdom of our partnership. Egypt prospered under our joint rule, benefiting from policies that combined practical knowledge with visionary leadership, military strength with diplomatic wisdom, respect for tradition with openness to innovation. The underground network we had discovered and mapped became the foundation for a transportation and communication system that connected every corner of the kingdom, while the precedent of shared leadership influenced other nations to experiment with collaborative governance models. But beyond these public achievements, what mattered most to me was the private joy of sharing my life with someone who understood and appreciated every aspect of who I was. The man who had saved me from sacrifice had also saved me from loneliness, giving me not just love but the opportunity to contribute to something larger than myself. As we grew older together, our bond deepened rather than weakened, strengthened by shared challenges and enriched by mutual accomplishments. We learned that true partnership requires not just love but respect, not just passion but patience, not just attraction but the willingness to support each other through difficulties and celebrate each other's successes. The tattoos that covered my body gradually faded with age, but the knowledge they had preserved lived on in the maps and records that became the foundation for Egypt's continued prosperity. More importantly, the love they had helped to create between Amenhotep and me became a living example of what was possible when two people committed themselves to building something beautiful together. In the end, our story became part of Egypt's eternal memory, a testament to the power of love to transform individual lives and entire kingdoms. The cartographer who had once mapped the physical landscape of the Nile Valley had discovered something far more valuable: the emotional geography of the human heart and the territories of possibility that opened when two souls chose to explore them together. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. That love is not just about finding happiness but about creating it, not just about being saved but about saving each other, not just about personal fulfillment but about using that fulfillment to make the world a better place for everyone who comes after us. The greatest map I ever created was not tattooed on my skin but written in the story of our love, a guide for all those who would follow in our footsteps toward the promised land of mutual understanding and shared joy. But our story was far from finished. The establishment of our joint rule marked not an ending but a new beginning, as we discovered that the challenges of shared leadership were both more complex and more rewarding than either of us had anticipated. The ancient traditions of Egyptian kingship had to be carefully modified to accommodate two rulers working in partnership, while foreign dignitaries struggled to understand how to conduct diplomacy with a divided but unified authority. The first major test of our co-rulership came in the form of a diplomatic crisis with the Hittite Empire, whose king had died unexpectedly, leaving his throne to a young and inexperienced heir. The Hittites had long been Egypt's primary rival for control of the Levantine territories, and the succession crisis presented both opportunities and dangers that required careful navigation. Traditional Egyptian diplomacy would have involved sending a single ambassador with clearly defined authority to negotiate on Pharaoh's behalf. But our joint rule meant that any major diplomatic initiative required coordination between two perspectives, two sets of priorities, and two different approaches to problem solving. The solution we developed became a model for future diplomatic missions. Rather than sending a single representative, we dispatched a joint embassy headed by two ambassadors of equal rank, each empowered to speak for one of us while being bound to work together to achieve common goals. I selected our diplomatic team based on the geographical knowledge that remained my primary expertise, choosing individuals who understood the complex territorial disputes that lay at the heart of Hittite-Egyptian relations. Amenhotep focused on the political and military aspects, ensuring that our ambassadors understood both the opportunities and the red lines that would govern any potential agreement. The negotiations took months, with our ambassadors sending regular reports that allowed us to adjust our positions in response to changing circumstances. What emerged was a treaty that redefined the relationship between our kingdoms, establishing clear spheres of influence while creating mechanisms for peaceful resolution of future disputes. But the most significant aspect of the agreement was its recognition of our joint rule as legitimate and binding. The Hittite king formally acknowledged both of us as equal rulers of Egypt, setting a precedent that would influence diplomatic relations throughout the ancient world. The success of our Hittite diplomacy demonstrated that shared leadership could be not just functional but actually superior to traditional autocracy in certain circumstances. The combination of different perspectives and areas of expertise produced solutions that neither of us would have developed independently. This principle was tested again when a series of poor Nile floods threatened Egypt with famine. The traditional response to such crises had always been to implement emergency rationing and hope that the next flood season would be more favorable. But our joint analysis of the situation suggested that more innovative approaches might be possible. My geographical knowledge revealed that certain regions of Egypt had access to alternative water sources that could be developed to supplement the reduced Nile flow. Ancient wells that had been abandoned during periods of abundant flooding could be restored, while underground springs identified during our tunnel explorations could be tapped to irrigate critical agricultural areas. Amenhotep's administrative expertise enabled the rapid mobilization of resources needed to implement these emergency measures. His understanding of Egypt's bureaucratic structures allowed him to cut through normal procedures and authorize the immediate deployment of labor and materials to the most critical locations. The famine was averted, but the experience taught us valuable lessons about crisis management that would influence our approach to governance for years to come. We established permanent monitoring systems to identify potential problems before they became critical, while creating stockpiles of essential supplies that could be deployed rapidly when emergencies arose. More importantly, we learned that our different strengths were most valuable not when applied separately but when combined in integrated approaches to complex problems. My knowledge of Egypt's physical geography was most useful when paired with his understanding of political and social dynamics, while his administrative skills were most effective when guided by detailed information about local conditions and resources. This integration of our capabilities became even more important as we began to address longer-term challenges facing the kingdom. Egypt's prosperity had always depended on the predictable annual flooding of the Nile, but our experiences during the famine years had shown us how vulnerable this dependence made us to natural variations. We began to develop what would become one of our most ambitious projects, a comprehensive system of water management that would reduce Egypt's vulnerability to flood variations while expanding the kingdom's agricultural capacity. The underground network that had given us military advantages could also serve as a water distribution system, carrying irrigation water to regions that had previously been too arid for cultivation. The engineering challenges were enormous, requiring the construction of new canals, the restoration of ancient waterworks, and the development of entirely new technologies for water storage and distribution. But the potential benefits were equally enormous. Millions of additional acres of farmland, reduced vulnerability to natural disasters, and the capacity to support a much larger population. The project took over a decade to complete, requiring the coordinated efforts of thousands of workers and the investment of vast resources. But when it was finished, Egypt possessed the most sophisticated water management system in the ancient world, a network of canals, reservoirs, and distribution channels that could maintain agricultural productivity even during the worst flood years. The success of our water management project established our reputations as not just effective rulers but innovative leaders whose vision extended far beyond traditional approaches to governance. Foreign delegations came to Egypt specifically to study our methods, while our own people began to see the advantages of collaborative leadership. But perhaps the most significant change was in our own relationship. The years of working together on increasingly complex projects had deepened our partnership beyond anything we could have imagined during our early days at court. We had learned to anticipate each other's thoughts, to build upon each other's ideas, to create solutions that neither could have developed independently. Our physical relationship had also evolved during this period, becoming less desperate and more secure as we grew confident in the permanence of our bond. The passion remained, but it was now accompanied by a profound sense of companionship that made every aspect of our lives more meaningful. The private moments we shared became even more precious as our public responsibilities increased. Each evening, when the formal business of ruling was concluded, we would retreat to our private chambers where we could simply be ourselves without the need for royal protocol or public performance. These quiet hours together often produced our most important insights about governance and policy. Away from the formal atmosphere of the council chamber, we could discuss problems freely, debate alternative approaches without concern for political implications, and develop innovative solutions that might seem too radical to propose in public settings. It was during one of these private conversations that we first discussed what would become our most controversial initiative: the establishment of formal education systems that would be available to all Egyptian children regardless of their social status. Traditional Egyptian society had always limited advanced education to the nobility and the priesthood, while common people were expected to learn only the skills necessary for their hereditary occupations. But our own experiences had shown us the value of knowledge and learning in addressing complex challenges. My rise from humble cartographer to co-pharaoh demonstrated that talent and dedication could be found at any level of society, while our joint successes proved that diverse perspectives and areas of expertise could produce superior results. We began to develop plans for schools that would teach not just basic literacy and mathematics, but also practical skills like engineering, medicine, and administration. The goal was to create a more educated population that could contribute to Egypt's continued prosperity while also providing opportunities for talented individuals to advance based on merit rather than birth. The proposal faced fierce opposition from traditional nobles and priests who saw universal education as a threat to their privileged positions. If commoners could read and write, if they understood mathematics and engineering, if they possessed the knowledge that had previously been restricted to the elite, then what would justify the existing social hierarchy? The debate over education policy became one of the most contentious issues of our reign, dividing the court into factions that supported or opposed radical social change. Conservative nobles argued that disrupting traditional social structures would lead to chaos and instability, while more progressive voices suggested that Egypt's future prosperity depended on developing all of its human resources. The resolution of this conflict required all of our diplomatic and political skills. Rather than attempting to impose change through royal decree, we chose to implement our education initiatives gradually, starting with pilot programs in selected regions where local leaders were supportive of innovation. The initial results exceeded our most optimistic expectations. Children from farming families proved capable of mastering complex mathematical concepts when given proper instruction, while young people from artisan backgrounds demonstrated remarkable aptitude for engineering and architectural design. More importantly, the communities that participated in our education experiments began to show measurable improvements in agricultural productivity, craft quality, and general prosperity. The connection between education and economic development became impossible to deny, even for the most conservative nobles. The success of our pilot programs led to gradual expansion of educational opportunities throughout Egypt. We established training colleges for teachers, developed standardized curricula for different age groups, and created systems for identifying and nurturing exceptional talent, regardless of social background. Within a generation, Egypt possessed the most educated population in the ancient world, with literacy rates that far exceeded those of neighboring kingdoms. The practical benefits were evident in everything from improved agricultural techniques to more sophisticated craftsmanship to more effective administration of government services. But the long-term implications went far beyond immediate practical benefits. By making education available to all, we had created a society in which social mobility was possible, where talented individuals could rise to positions of responsibility based on their abilities rather than their birth circumstances. This transformation of Egyptian society was perhaps our greatest achievement as rulers, more significant than military victories or diplomatic successes because it changed the fundamental nature of our civilization. We had created a kingdom where human potential could be fully developed regardless of the circumstances of birth. The personal cost of these social innovations was significant, as we faced constant pressure from conservative factions who saw our reforms as threats to traditional values and established privileges. There were several attempts to organize rebellions against our rule, though these were successfully suppressed through a combination of military action and political negotiation. More challenging was the subtle but persistent campaign of criticism from religious authorities who argued that our reforms violated divine law by disrupting the social order that the gods had established. High Priest Hamu, despite his earlier acceptance of my position at court, became increasingly vocal in his opposition to what he called our dangerous experiments with Egyptian society. The religious opposition came to a head during a major religious festival when Hamu publicly challenged our authority to make such fundamental changes to Egyptian civilization. Standing before thousands of pilgrims, he declared that the gods were angry about our violations of traditional social hierarchies and demanded a return to the ancient ways. The challenge was carefully calculated to put us in an impossible position. If we dismissed Hamu's criticism, we would appear to be rejecting religious authority and risking divine displeasure. But if we accepted his arguments, we would be abandoning the reforms that we believed were essential for Egypt's future prosperity. Our response demonstrated how much our partnership had matured during our years of joint rule. Rather than reacting defensively to Hamu's challenge, we chose to address it directly through public debate that would allow the Egyptian people to hear all sides of the argument. The Great Debate, as it came to be known, took place in the courtyard of the Temple of Ptah before an audience that included representatives from every level of Egyptian society. Hamu presented the traditional argument that social hierarchies were divinely ordained and should not be altered by mortal rulers, while we argued that the gods had given humans intelligence and creativity specifically so they could improve their condition through learning and innovation. The debate lasted for 3 days, with each side presenting detailed arguments supported by references to ancient texts, historical precedents, and practical examples. The audience was allowed to ask questions and offer their own perspectives, making it less a formal legal proceeding than a genuine exploration of fundamental questions about the nature of society and governance. What emerged from this public discussion was a broader understanding of the issues involved and a recognition that both sides had valid concerns. Traditional social structures had provided stability and continuity for thousands of years, but they had also limited Egypt's ability to develop its full potential by restricting opportunities for talented individuals from humble backgrounds. The resolution we eventually reached satisfied neither the most conservative traditionalists nor the most radical reformers but gained broad support from the majority of Egyptians who wanted both stability and progress. We agreed to maintain respect for traditional religious and social institutions while continuing to expand educational and economic opportunities based on merit. This compromise became the foundation for what historians would later call the Egyptian Renaissance, a period of unprecedented cultural and intellectual flowering that lasted for several centuries. The combination of respect for tradition with openness to innovation created an environment where creativity could flourish while maintaining social stability. The artistic achievements of this period were particularly remarkable, as newly educated artisans and craftsmen developed techniques and styles that surpassed anything previously accomplished in Egyptian history. Architecture reached new levels of sophistication, sculpture achieved unprecedented realism and emotional depth, and literature explored themes and forms that had never been attempted before. But perhaps the most significant cultural development was the emergence of historical writing that attempted to understand and record the actual events of our time rather than simply celebrating the glorious deeds of rulers. These chronicles, written by scholars from various social backgrounds, provided future generations with detailed accounts of how our reforms were implemented and what effects they had on Egyptian society. Reading these historical accounts in later years, Amenhotep and I were struck by how differently our contemporaries perceived our partnership compared to how we experienced it ourselves. The historians focused on our public achievements and political innovations, while we remembered the private moments of doubt and discovery that had shaped our decisions. The truth was that our success as rulers had depended as much on personal factors as on political strategies. The trust we had developed in each other, the way we had learned to combine our different strengths, the deep emotional bond that sustained us through difficult periods, all of these intimate aspects of our relationship were essential to our public effectiveness. This realization led us to establish what became one of our most enduring innovations: a formal system for training future rulers in the principles of collaborative leadership. Rather than assuming that effective governance was an innate ability that could not be taught, we created programs that would help potential leaders develop the skills needed for successful partnership. The Royal Academy, as it came to be known, became a model for similar institutions throughout the ancient world. Students learned not just the practical skills of administration and diplomacy, but also the interpersonal abilities needed for effective collaboration. They studied case histories of successful partnerships, practiced negotiation and consensus-building techniques, and developed their understanding of how different personality types could work together productively. The Academy's graduates went on to serve not just in Egypt but in kingdoms throughout the Mediterranean world, spreading the principles of collaborative governance and helping to establish more stable and effective political systems. The influence of our educational innovations extended far beyond Egypt's borders, contributing to what historians would later identify as a general improvement in governmental effectiveness throughout the ancient world. But the institution we were most proud of was much smaller and more personal. The program we established for identifying and mentoring young people who showed exceptional potential for leadership regardless of their social backgrounds. These individuals were brought to court for intensive training in all aspects of governance, with the understanding that they would eventually serve in high-level positions throughout the kingdom. Many of these protégés came from the same humble origins that had once characterized my own background. Farmers' children who showed exceptional mathematical ability, artisans' offspring who demonstrated unusual strategic thinking, merchants' sons who displayed remarkable diplomatic skills. All were given opportunities to develop their talents and contribute to Egypt's continued prosperity. Watching these young people flourish under our guidance reminded us constantly of how fortunate we had been to find each other and to create the partnership that had made our achievements possible. We saw in their success a validation of our belief that human potential exists at every level of society, and that the key to effective governance is finding ways to identify and develop that potential. The mentoring relationships we established with these promising young leaders also enriched our own lives in unexpected ways. Teaching others about the principles and practices of collaborative governance forced us to articulate ideas that we had developed intuitively through years of working together. More importantly, the process of passing on our knowledge and experience to the next generation gave deeper meaning to everything we had accomplished. Our innovations would not die with us but would continue to influence Egyptian society long after we were gone. As we entered the later years of our reign, this sense of legacy became increasingly important to both of us. We had transformed Egypt from a traditional autocracy into something unprecedented in the ancient world. A kingdom governed through genuine partnership between equals who brought different but complementary strengths to the challenges of leadership. The kingdom we would eventually pass on to our successors was stronger, more prosperous, and more just than the one we had inherited. But more importantly, we had established principles and institutions that would enable future rulers to build upon our achievements rather than simply attempting to maintain what we had created. The selection of our successors became one of our final major challenges as rulers. Egyptian tradition called for the throne to pass to the pharaoh's eldest son, but our unique situation as co-rulers who had no biological children together required the development of new succession protocols. After extensive consultation with legal scholars, religious authorities, and representatives of the general population, we established a system that combined traditional elements with innovative features designed to preserve the collaborative nature of our governance model. Our successors would be chosen from among the most promising graduates of our leadership training programs, with the selection based on demonstrated ability rather than hereditary right. The transition process took several years to complete, as we gradually transferred responsibilities to our chosen successors while remaining available to provide guidance and advice when needed. The young men we selected had worked closely with us for years and understood both the practical techniques and the underlying principles of collaborative leadership. Watching them take over the daily responsibilities of governing Egypt was both satisfying and bittersweet. We were proud of how well they had learned the lessons we had tried to teach, but we also felt the natural sadness that comes with recognizing that one phase of life is ending and another beginning. The formal ceremony that marked our retirement from active rule was held in the same throne room where I had once faced execution as a sacrificial victim. Standing before the assembled court, we transferred the symbols of royal authority to our successors while receiving the thanks of a grateful kingdom for our years of service. But the most meaningful moment came that evening, when we were finally alone together in the private chambers we had shared for so many years. The weight of royal responsibility had been lifted from our shoulders, leaving us free to focus entirely on each other and on the relationship that had been the foundation of everything we had accomplished. "We have done something remarkable," Amenhotep said as we held each other in the darkness. "We have not just ruled a kingdom but transformed it, not just maintained power but used it to create something better than what existed before. We have also proven that love can be a source of strength rather than weakness," I replied, my fingers tracing the familiar contours of his face. "That two people who care deeply for each other can accomplish more together than either could achieve alone." The years of our retirement were among the happiest of our lives, as we finally had the freedom to focus entirely on each other without the constant demands of governing a kingdom. We traveled extensively throughout Egypt, revisiting places that held special memories while discovering new locations that we had never had time to explore during our busy years of active rule. These journeys allowed us to see the long-term effects of our policies and reforms in ways that had not been possible while we were still responsible for day-to-day governance. Villages that had once struggled with poverty now showed clear signs of prosperity, with well-built houses, thriving markets, and children who could read and write. The educational systems we had established were producing results that exceeded our most optimistic projections. Young adults who had grown up in our reformed society demonstrated levels of knowledge and capability that would have been impossible under the old system of restricted education. But perhaps the most gratifying discovery was that the collaborative principles we had promoted were being adopted not just by our official successors but by leaders at every level of Egyptian society. Village councils were making decisions through consensus building rather than autocratic decree, while craft guilds were organizing themselves along democratic lines that gave every member a voice in important decisions. The transformation of Egyptian society was more complete and more lasting than we had dared to hope during our years of active reform. We had not just changed specific policies but had altered the fundamental culture of the kingdom, creating new expectations about how leaders should behave and how decisions should be made. These observations filled our retirement years with a deep sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. We had not just lived interesting lives but had used our lives to make a meaningful difference in the world, to leave Egypt better than we had found it. The love that had brought us together and sustained us through decades of shared challenges remained as strong as ever, deepened by years of mutual support and enriched by the knowledge that we had created something beautiful together. The bond between us had not just survived the pressures of public life but had been strengthened by them. As we grew older together, we often reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought us from our first meeting in the throne room to our current position as respected elder statesmen whose advice was still sought by Egypt's current rulers. The changes seemed almost impossible to believe, but they had happened through the combination of love, determination, and the willingness to work together toward common goals. The tattoos that had once covered my body had faded with age, but the knowledge they had preserved lived on in the maps and records that continued to guide Egypt's development. More importantly, the love they had helped to create between us had become a living example of what was possible when two people committed themselves completely to each other's happiness and success. Our story had become part of Egyptian legend, told and retold by successive generations as an example of how love could triumph over adversity and transform not just individual lives but entire civilizations. The cartographer who had once faced death as a sacrificial victim and the Pharaoh who had saved him had together created something that would outlast their mortal lives. In our final years together, as we sat in the garden of our retirement home watching the sun set over the Nile, we would often speak of the lessons our experience had taught us about the nature of love and partnership. True collaboration, we had learned, required not just affection but respect, not just passion but patience, not just attraction but the willingness to subordinate individual desires to shared goals. We had discovered that the greatest achievements came not from competition but from cooperation, not from trying to dominate each other but from finding ways to combine our different strengths into something greater than the sum of its parts. The love that had begun as personal attraction had evolved into a partnership that had literally changed the world. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of our story. That love at its best is not just about personal happiness but about using that happiness to create something beautiful and lasting that enriches the lives of others. The greatest map we ever created together was not drawn on paper or tattooed on skin, but written in the transformed society we left behind. a guide for all future generations who would seek to build their own partnerships based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and unwavering commitment to each other's growth and happiness. As the desert remembers all things, so too does love endure beyond the individuals who create it, becoming part of the eternal human story of how two hearts beating as one can accomplish miracles that neither could achieve alone. Our love had become immortal, not because we were exceptional people, but because we had chosen to use our love in service of something greater than ourselves, creating a legacy that would inspire others to seek the same transcendent partnership that had blessed our lives with meaning and joy.